Welcome to another discussion of Jane Eyre. This time the subject is how social status is presented and observed, and how the young governess reacts to the new visitors. There is a concern by Jane Eyre that her new feelings of love for Mr. Rochester are not acceptable. Her fantasy that he could show affection and eventually form a relationship is eclipsed by reality. She comes from a questionable background of the lower classes as no better than a hired servant. He is not of your order. Keep to your caste, she tells herself. That is one of the original criticisms of the book, that Jane Eyre didn't stay in her place, but was proud beyond her station. The character recognizes this convention and seeks to extinguish any ideas she might have of becoming enchanted by the rich man because it could only end badly. She seeks instead to remain, as she always has, in the background as an observer of those around her. What she notices both expresses the humanity of the higher classes and their false appearances. Without her appointment as governess for Adele, Jane Eyre would not have had the opportunity to mingle, however the distance, with the rich elites of the area. She was expressly hired to watch over the girl and be her teacher. Despite Adele's mother belonging to the lower theater class, she was more accustomed to mixing with those above her rank. It was probable that her mother as an opera dancer was watched by those who had enough money to afford attending her performances. As a little girl, she learned how to be cultured by watching her mother surrounded by the elites. No doubt her mother, like in the story told by Mr. Rochester of his own infatuation, was beautiful and flirtatious. She had learned how to take her acting off the stage and into the audience. This wouldn't have been that unusual because the higher classes often were known to have affairs with those at least a few degrees below them in the social order. What was never acceptable was either of them taking the relationships more seriously than an amusement or short-term romance. Most likely, Adele's mother knew this when she struck up a relationship with Mr. Rochester, and then soon found another man. If Jane Eyre was trying to avoid a mismatch, Mr. Rochester had already shown a willingness to break the boundaries. From the introduction of the fine ladies and gentlemen, it is clear what side of the social wall Jane Eyre belongs. Again, she already knows this, but the picture of her among the servants and watching the elites from a distance reinforced that information. The servants clustered around a fire and went back and forth at beck and call. Before the arrival of these visitors, Jane Eyre helped with the cleaning up of the mansion along with all the other hired servants. When the rich ladies and gentlemen came into view, they fluttered downstairs with a quick glance. Jane had never seen such fine people in her life, and could only listen to them from a distance once settled. When Adele is allowed to come down to be introduced, Jane doesn't expect to accompany her. However, Mr. Rochester insists, and in fact commands like the master he is, that she join the group. She reluctantly complies. Once closer to the well-dressed company, there is still a large gulf between Jane and the guests. In this case, it is symbolized by curtains that either they or she comes out from behind. The dining room, like a stage, is well lit by many candles. A curtain separates the dining hall from the gathering room. When the elites leave the dining hall, the curtain rises and falls like actors coming out to perform. Jane remarks how magnificent they look, as if birds of brilliant plumage. She has described herself as a bird, but more about wanting to take flight than how she looked. No doubt, in all respects, she felt out of place. It is for this reason that she resorts to her usual behavior: stay quiet, out of sight, and almost invisible. Adele, on the other hand, has no misgivings. She rushes out to meet these festive people, eager to make an impression. For most of them, she is treated as, if not one of them, at least a precious young child to dote over. They especially want to talk with her in French. That is probably what sets her apart from them, from an average girl to be ignored. At least, to almost all of them except the person Jane Eyre is most interested in, Blanche Ingram, her romantic rival. Blanche comes to special consideration for Jane Eyre precisely because she stands in the way of any romantic hopes. She watches the interaction of Miss Ingram and Mr. Rochester when the two are together. It is clear that Blanche Ingram is doing all she can to get the attention of Mr. Rochester with her flirting and physical closeness. But Jane Eyre doubts any of this is going to do any good. She believes she detects a lack of true romantic feelings for her from Mr. Rochester, as he rebuffs all of her attempts to make him interested. There are things that Miss Ingram does and doesn't do that Jane says she knows Mr. Rochester would not be impressed by. By contrast, Jane believes that she knows how to reach Mr. Rochester's heart and gain his love. That doesn't mean that Jane believes that Mr. Rochester would eventually want to marry her instead of Miss Ingram, because there is a significant class difference. No, Mr. Rochester would be forced by convenience and money to marry without love. She was a perfect prospect for the rich and high-class man who would nonetheless give his love to another of lower station. He couldn't follow his heart because it would not be logical to do that. He belonged to these people. He was one of them. Jane wasn't, and that didn't make her jealous or upset. She had observed this woman up close and in dress and conversation. If anything, she felt pity for her and Mr. Rochester if they did get married one day. Jane described her as very showy but not genuine. Married life for the illustrious couple would be like prison. It seemed that playing a role was part of participating in elite society. They might look down at those who are not on the same stage as they are, but they amuse themselves by imagining life with or as lower class. The younger women, especially, according to Blanche Ingram, wish they could fall in love with a rogue or pirate. They imagine their burly men taking them away on adventures with unchecked romance. The men that they do court and have available are described as weak and dainty, a bit feminine. Most likely, if they ever did meet any men like they imagined, the last thing they would do is start some kind of relationship. They would take one look at them and turn up their noses. Maintaining social position was their priority. What roles they play in their social positions is demonstrated most when a supposed gypsy fortune-teller comes to the house. At first, they want the old woman ran out of the house, but when the gypsy will not leave, they give in. There's no sign of respect for the gypsy. The response to this old woman wanting to tell them their future breaks down into predictable stereotypes. Older matrons are aghast and warn that no good can come from letting her in, no matter how insistent. The younger women aren't any more happy at her intrusion, but are cautiously curious. They want to know their futures, even if as a whimsical game. Finally, all the men are disinterested and find the whole thing amusing. None are described as differing from expected rank or opinions. Even Mr. Rochester cannot break from his social order when interacting with Jane Eyre, no matter how much he wanted to. Twice he comes close to declaring his love for her, but stops short of saying the word. The first time was when Jane refused to join the charade game, having tired of observing and knowing they didn't like her. After all, they discussed all the terrible things they had done to their own governess when growing up, with the older ladies expressing disdain. Mr. Rochester caught her in the hall and begged her to return and participate. She kindly refused and told him she was tired and wanted only to go to bed. He accepted this and said, "My," without finishing what she was to be to him. The second occurred after she helped him in a crisis. He talked about his restless and sin-infested life and how he wanted to reform. There was someone he finally had met who could help him with the final transformation, to once again be a decent person. Jane informs him that only God can change a person and improve them, but Mr. Rochester insists that God had an instrument for helping. He believes he had found the instrument in, and stopped short of saying who that instrument was. He then talked about marriage to Miss Ingram and asked if Jane could assist him when that time came. No matter how much he wanted to be part of Jane Eyre's life and let love take over, he couldn't put these feelings into words or actions. They ran counter to where he stood in his high position. In the second instance, he had to make it seem the description of an instrument of his reformation was a woman his societal equal, if not equal in all other things. But it isn't always easy to know what social position someone belonged. When this happens, then it seems all order of any kind is lost in confusion. With a lone visitor named Mason, Jane disliked him at the first sight. There's nothing about him that indicates why he has come, or if he is equal to the more elite guests. He doesn't seem to have a problem talking with the others, but how Mr. Rochester reacts when learning the man has arrived makes little sense. He becomes afraid that anyone will know why he is at the residence, and nervous to meet with him. Yet when he does talk with the man, Mr. Rochester orders him around as if a servant. Then there is Grace Poole, that is the antagonist of Jane Eyre, because of what horror she thinks this woman represents. She doesn't understand how Mr. Rochester keeps her employed and not run out of the mansion. Perhaps she has a past with him, much like he had with Adelaide's mother. He must owe her or have some past affections that are unbreakable. Whatever the reason, Jane thinks of her as a terrible and dangerous woman. Everyone has a part to play and a position to keep. There's no reason for Jane Eyre to assume otherwise. The closer she observes the higher-class ladies and gentlemen, the more they seem fake and lacking genuine character. They are as stuck in their world as they force the servants and lower classes to remain underneath them. From these observations, it might seem reasonable that Jane Eyre would detest this false social order. On the contrary, she insists, through narrative example, breaking from this has devastating consequences. What happens upstairs with Mason, Mr. Rochester, and supposedly Grace Poole is caused by not knowing who is the true master. A disordered world begins to break apart with confusion and violence. How love might overcome, or overturn, or even cause this, has yet to be seen. Click the subscribe button and notification bell to not miss the next installments and analysis.